Every structure gives you a warning before it fails. I know that better than almost anyone. 22 years of reading stress fractures in concrete, watching hairline cracks spread across a retaining wall months before anyone else notices them. I know what it looks like when something is about to give. I just never thought to look for it in myself. The morning it happened, I remember the light in my office was the flat gray kind that Columbus gets in October, the kind that makes everything look like it's already half finished. I'd been at my desk since 6:30, same as always, going over elevation drawings for a culvert replacement on the west side. My coffee had gone cold 2 hours earlier and I hadn't noticed. That should have told me something. A man who doesn't notice his coffee going cold is a man who has stopped noticing a lot of things. The dizziness had been there since I woke up, but I'd filed it away the way I filed away everything that year, under stress, under not enough sleep, under I'll deal with it later. By 11, there was a tightness sitting low in my chest, not sharp, not dramatic, just present, the way a bad hinge is present before it finally seizes. I told myself it was the burrito I'd eaten too fast at my desk the day before. Engineers are supposed to be precise. We're supposed to trust measurements over feelings. And yet I spent that entire morning misreading every single measurement my own body was giving me. By 2 o'clock, the edges of the room had started to go soft. Not dark, not yet, just soft, like someone had smudged a thumb across wet ink at the corners of my vision. I remember thinking, distantly, almost professionally, that if a bridge support behaved like this, if it started losing definition at the edges under load, you'd shut the whole span down immediately. You wouldn't wait to see how much worse it got. I had that thought, clear as anything, and I kept working anyway. At 2:15, I reached for a roll of elevation plans on the corner of my desk. And the room tipped sideways in a way rooms aren't supposed to tip. I heard the blueprints go before I felt myself go, that sharp crack of rolled paper hitting concrete, loud and flat in the quiet of the drafting room. And then there was nothing. No pain, no fear, no last thought about Diane or the bridge or anything at all. Just the sound of paper hitting the floor, and then 4 hours I don't have any memory of. I woke up in a room at Ohio Health Grant Medical Center with an IV taped into the back of my hand and electrodes running across my chest like wiring on a panel that somebody else had installed without asking me. The light in there was the kind of white that doesn't belong to any time of day. A monitor beside me was tracking the one thing in my life I had never once thought to monitor myself, my own heartbeat, tracing it out in green light like a load diagram nobody had bothered to show me until the structure had already started to fail. A doctor was standing at the foot of the bed when I came around, mid-sentence, explaining something about a hypertensive crisis and a cardiac event, close to the edge of something worse. I heard maybe half of it. The rest of me was already somewhere else, already doing the thing I do, running numbers, checking for the load-bearing fact underneath all the noise. And the fact I landed on wasn't my own heart. It was this: nobody had called me back. I looked past the doctor to the nurse standing near the door, a clipboard against her chest, and I asked her the only question that mattered to me in that moment. "Did you reach my wife?" She said yes. She said they'd called the number listed as my emergency contact. The number I'd carried in my phone for 18 years, Diane's number. And then something changed in her face, some small professional recalibration, the look of someone choosing her next words the way you choose which board can actually bear weight. She said Diane was aware of the situation. Aware of the situation. I lay there with wires running out of my chest and I turned that phrase over and over, the way you turn over a stone that doesn't look right in your hand, checking it from every angle because you can't quite believe what you're holding. Not I'm on my way. Not I'm 15 minutes out. Not even I can't get there, but tell him I love him. Just aware, a word you use for weather. A word you use for a delay on a flight. Not a word anyone should ever have to hear about the person who slept beside them for 18 years. The nurse didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Some sentences are honest precisely because of what they leave out, and hers was the kind that told me everything by refusing to tell me anything at all. It just hung there in that white room, unfinished, the way a crack hangs in a wall right before somebody finally admits the whole thing needs to come down. To understand how a marriage ends up producing a moment like that, you have to go back further than the hospital. You have to go back to the beginning, because nothing fails all at once. Not bridges, not marriages. Something has to give a little first, quietly, in a place nobody thinks to look. I met Diane in the summer of 1999, at a 4th of July party in Westerville. On a lawn full of people I didn't know and a cooler of beer somebody's cousin had driven up from Kentucky. She was standing near the grill laughing at something, head tipped back, completely unguarded, and I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone take up a room the way she did without trying. I was 25, she was 24. 2 years later, we were married in her parents' backyard in Worthington, under a tent her father Gerald had rented and paid for and would go on mentioning. In one form or another, for the next 2 decades, Gerald Whitfield built a chain of auto supply stores across central Ohio from nothing, sold it for more than he ever expected, and retired at 62 with all the time in the world and an opinion about everything he could reach. At our wedding, he shook my hand hard enough to make a point and said, "Well, Diane could have done worse." He said it smiling. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. It took me years to understand that Gerald rarely said anything he hadn't already decided was true. For a long time, that didn't matter. We had a good marriage. I want to say that plainly, because it would be easy to tell this story as if the ending was written from the start, and it wasn't. We bought a colonial in Dublin in 2004, and Diane turned the backyard into something out of a magazine, string lights and a stone path she laid herself one weekend while I was at a job site. She worked part-time at a pediatric practice. In the evenings she'd call her sister Lena, who lived 20 minutes away in Gahanna. And I'd hear her laughing through the wall, that same unguarded laugh from the 4th of July, and I'd think, this is what it's supposed to sound like. I didn't mind Lena in those early years. She was quick, funny in short bursts, the kind of person who could turn a boring dinner into a story worth telling later. What I didn't notice, not for a long time, was the residue those calls left behind. Diane would hang up the phone different than when she picked it up. Quieter, a little more aware of what she didn't have, a little more likely, an hour later, to mention that Lena thought we should be doing something differently with our money, or that Gerald thought I was working too much, or that Gerald thought the kitchen renovation was a waste when we could have put that money into something that actually appreciated. Gerald thought. That phrase started showing up in our house the way water shows up in a basement, slow, at the edges, easy to blame on the weather. Gerald thought I should have taken the transportation authority job instead of staying with the city. Gerald thought we should have bought the property on the north side before the market moved. I'm an engineer. I know that a structure rarely fails from one blow. It fails from load it was never designed to carry, applied a little at a time, in places nobody thought to reinforce. That's what was happening to us, and I was too busy running numbers on other people's bridges to check the ones holding up my own house. The night it really started, I remember exactly. A Sunday, 2 years before I collapsed. Diane came home from dinner at Gerald's, one of those standing bi-weekly dinners in Upper Arlington I missed more often than not because of deadlines, and she sat down across from me at the kitchen table with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Careful, rehearsed. I think we need to talk about where we are, she said. I asked her what she meant. I feel like you're here, but you're not here, she said. Lena thinks, and there it was, that name again, arriving in our conversation like it had been invited. Lena thinks it's not really about your schedule. She thinks it's something deeper. Something we're not compatible on. I sat with that for a second too long. Then I said the wrong thing, the thing I still think about. And is Lena's opinion something we're going to keep giving a vote on our marriage? I watched it land. I watched something close behind her eyes. It wasn't untrue, what I'd said, but it was cruel in its precision, and I knew it the moment it left my mouth. What I couldn't say, what would have actually helped, was the truth underneath it, that her words had found the one soft place in me I never let anyone near. 22 years of taking pressure and pushing it down instead of out. I didn't know how to do it any other way. We tried counseling. Dr. Patricia Howell, an office off Morse Road with a white noise machine humming outside her door and a box of tissues angled just so on the side table. 16 weeks of talking in careful circles, of Diane saying she felt alone and me saying I didn't know what more I could give, until Dr. Howell finally suggested, gently, that we might need individual work before we could do the work together. Diane went. I went twice, sat in that chair like it was an interrogation room, and told myself I was too busy to keep going back. That decision sits with me still. Of everything I do differently, that one's near the top. After that, the house started shifting in ways too slow to name. Diane's weekends at her father's stretched longer. Saturday afternoons became overnight stays. I'd come home Friday to a note on the counter, gone to Dad's, back Sunday, and I'd stand in the kitchen alone and tell myself this was normal. Families are close, there was nothing wrong with a grown woman visiting her father. I believed that because it was easier than the alternative. I threw myself into the bridge project instead, the West Side replacement I'd been leading for 3 years, finally breaking ground, finally demanding everything I had left to give. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped reaching for her the way a marriage needs you to keep reaching, not because I'd stopped caring, but because every time I tried, I met something in her that had already started pulling back. It was that spring the chest pains started. Small at first, a tightness under the sternum after a long day hunched over drawings. I told myself it was posture. I told myself it was the coffee, the stress, the hours. I took an antacid and kept working, the same way I'd been taking the small, private evidence of my marriage coming apart and filing it under things that would sort themselves out eventually. I didn't know yet that a body keeps its own kind of ledger. And that mine had been running a deficit for a long time. I just knew that some nights I'd lie next to Diane, both of us awake, neither of us saying anything, and the space between us in that bed felt wider than it had any right to feel for two people who'd built a whole life together. I didn't know it yet, but that space, and that tightness in my chest, were the same kind of warning. The kind you get right before something that's been failing quietly finally fails out loud. They kept me 4 days. 4 days is a long time to lie still with nothing to do but listen to a machine count out your own heartbeat and think about everything you've been too busy to think about for the last 2 years. The nurses were good to me. My colleagues sent a card, everybody in the department had signed it, even the city engineer, and somehow that meant more than I expected. Dale Whitten, who I'd worked beside for 14 years, came by the second afternoon and sat with me for an hour talking about the Reds bullpen and nothing else. And that was exactly the kindness I needed, a man who understood that some visits aren't for talking about what's actually wrong. Diane called that first evening. 6 minutes, I counted afterward, because by then I'd started keeping track of things like that, the way you start measuring load once you already suspect a structure's compromised. She said she was sorry this had happened. She said she hoped I'd get some rest. She said her father was going through some things, that it had been a stressful week for the family. And that she'd come see me when things settled down a bit. When things settled down a bit, I held the phone in my hand after we hung up and stared at the ceiling tile above my bed, counting the little pinholes in it like they might add up to something that made sense. They didn't. The next morning, my nurse, a woman named Brenda who moved through that room like she'd stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago, came in to check my vitals. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the particular way nurses look at men who say that. And said, "It's okay if you're not fine, you know. Most people aren't, in here." Nobody had said anything that simple and that true to me in longer than I could remember. I didn't cry, but for the first time since the blueprints hit the floor, I came close. It was the second afternoon when I finally picked up my phone. I hadn't wanted to look at it. Some part of me already knew what I'd find, or at least knew that whatever I found wasn't going to make anything easier. But there was a detail on the bridge project only I had in my head. Something that was going to cause real problems downstream if I didn't flag it, and so I unlocked the screen and opened my call log, and there it was. 44 missed calls. I sat with that number before I even opened it. 44, most of them from that first night, when I'd been unconscious and then sedated, unreachable to the whole world. Dale, 2 of my engineers, a hospital number I didn't recognize, the patient services line trying, and failing, to reach my emergency contact. Kevin, my brother, 3 separate times, each one a little more frantic than the last if the timestamps were anything to go by. And then, near the bottom, 2 calls from Diane. One from a landline I recognized instantly as Gerald's, out in Upper Arlington. 2 calls, out of 44, I opened the messages next, and there was a text from Diane, sent at 9:17 the night before, while I was lying somewhere in that building with wires taped to my chest and no memory of any of it. "Raymond, Dad's lawyer is saying we need to sit down and talk soon about some things. It's important and it can't wait. Please answer when you're feeling up to it." I read it once, then again, slower, like I might have misunderstood something the first time. Then a third time, in case there was a version of those words that didn't mean what I thought they meant. There wasn't. I'd been in that hospital almost 30 hours. I'd collapsed on a concrete floor and been carried out on a gurney. And the message from my wife, the woman I'd carried an emergency contact number for across 18 years, was about her father's lawyer, and something that couldn't wait. Not "I love you," not "I'm on my way," not even "I'm sorry I wasn't there." Just Dad's lawyer, something that can't wait. I set the phone face down on the tray table next to a lunch I hadn't touched, and I stared at the wall for a long time. Long enough that when I finally picked the phone back up, my hand wasn't quite steady, and not from the medication. I called Kevin. He picked up on the second ring. "Ray, Jesus, I've been losing my mind. What happened?" And I told him, all of it, not just the collapse, not just the hospital, but the 2 years underneath it, the Sunday dinners I'd stopped being invited to without ever being told I wasn't invited, the counseling that went nowhere, the note on the counter, the 6-minute phone call, and now this, 44 missed calls and a text about a lawyer. Kevin didn't say much while I talked. He just let me get through it. And when I finished, there was a pause on the line, and then he said, "You need me down there." I told him no. I told him I was fine, the same automatic lie I'd been telling everyone, including myself, for longer than I wanted to admit. But then I heard myself say something I hadn't planned on saying at all. "I think something's really wrong, Kev. Not with my heart, with everything." "I know," he said, quiet. "I've known for a while. I just didn't know how to say it to you without making it worse." It was the first fully honest conversation I'd had with another human being in longer than I could measure. That same evening, a message came in from Derek, a colleague from the department who'd stayed connected to Diane's family through some neighborhood league years back. "Hey man, not sure if you've seen this. You probably haven't. Take care of yourself." Attached was a screenshot. It was a photo from that afternoon. Diane, Lena, Gerald, Diane's mother Patrice, a few of the cousins, gathered around a picnic table in a park somewhere in Upper Arlington, sunlight coming in low and warm across the table, food spread out, somebody mid-laugh. Gerald was smiling, that composed, satisfied smile he wore in every photo, the one that said things were finally going the way Gerald Whitfield believed things ought to go. The caption, written by Lena, read, "Family day without the drama. Sometimes you just need your people around you." I looked at Diane in that photo for a long time. She wasn't laughing like the others. It was a smaller smile, careful, the kind you wear when you know the camera is on you and you're not entirely sure what your face is supposed to be doing. But she was there, in the sun, surrounded by her family, eating a meal. On the same afternoon I was lying in a hospital bed, 47 years old, with electrodes taped to my chest and a phone full of calls nobody had returned. Without the drama. I read those 4 words more times than I'd like to admit. And each time they landed a little colder than the last. I wanted to tell you that I called Diane back that night. That I said everything sitting hot behind my teeth, the fury I hadn't let out since the nurse first said those 4 careful words. Part of me wanted to. Part of me was furious in the way men get furious after 20 years of swallowing things instead of saying them, not loud, not a scene, just cold and total and complete. But I didn't call her. I put the phone down, and I lay back against that hospital pillow. And I thought about something my father used to say. Arthur Calloway spent 31 years as a building inspector for the city, and he had a way of talking that made you feel like he'd already thought through every version of a problem before you'd finished describing it. He used to say, "Don't let anybody rush you into a reaction, Raymond. A reaction is what they want. A response is what you choose." I decided, lying there, that I wasn't going to react. Not yet, not while I was weak, not while I still didn't understand the full shape of what I was looking at. I was going to pay attention first. And the first thing I did, once I'd made that decision, was pick the phone back up and call the one person I trusted to tell me the truth even when it cost him something. Kevin answered on the second ring. "Ray, Jesus, I've been losing my mind. What happened?" I told him everything, not just the collapse, not just the 4 days in that hospital bed, but all of it, going back 2 years. The Sunday dinners at Gerald's I'd stopped being invited to. The counseling that went nowhere, the note on the counter, the 6-minute phone call, the 44 missed calls, the text about the lawyer, the photo at the picnic table with its 4 cheerful words underneath. Kevin didn't interrupt. He let me get all the way through it, and when I finally stopped, there was a silence on the line that told me he was choosing his next words carefully. "You need me down there," he said. "No," I told him. "I'm fine, Ray. I'm fine, Kev. You collapsed at your desk," he said, and his voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard from my brother in years. "You've got 44 missed calls and 2 of them are from your own wife, and you're telling me you're fine. I've watched you say you're fine through 2 rounds of layoffs, a knee surgery, and mom's funeral. I know what fine means when you say it. It means you're not going to ask for help until it's already too late, and I'm not doing that again." I didn't have an answer for that right away. And then, without planning to, I said something I hadn't expected to say out loud. "I think something's really wrong, Kev. Not with my heart, with everything." "I know," he said, quieter now. "I've known for a while. I just didn't know how to say it to you without it sounding like I was going after Diane." That was the first fully honest conversation I'd had with another person in longer than I could remember, and it didn't come from Diane, and it didn't come from the doctors. It came from my brother, over a phone line, while I lay in a hospital bed with wires taped to my chest. Kevin drove down from Cleveland the next day. He didn't ask permission, and he didn't warn me he was coming. He was just there in the waiting room when they finally cleared me to leave on the fourth day, coat on, hands in his pockets, looking older than I always picture him but solid the way brothers who've known you your whole life are solid. He'd taken 2 days off work without telling his own boss why. He drove me home in silence for most of the ride, and when we pulled into the driveway, he looked at the house for a second before he got out, like he already knew what we were about to walk into. He was right, the house was clean, everything in its place, exactly the way Diane always kept it, and it was completely empty. There was a note on the kitchen counter in her handwriting. Gone to Dad's, back in a few days. Hope you're feeling better. Kevin read it over my shoulder and set it down without a word. Then he said, "You want coffee?" We sat at that kitchen table for 4 hours. Real talking, the kind I hadn't done with anyone in years, maybe not since before I married Diane at all. I told him about the way Gerald's opinions had crept into every decision we made, the property we didn't buy, the job I didn't take, the kitchen we renovated the wrong way according to a man who'd never once picked up a hammer in his life. I told him about Lena, about the calls that always seemed to leave Diane a little less satisfied with what she had. And Kevin listened, and then he told me something he said he'd been carrying for years and never known how to bring up. That man has never thought you were enough for her, he said. Not because of who you are, because of what you represent. You're somebody he didn't pick. And Gerald Whitfield doesn't forgive people for things he didn't pick himself. I thought about that. 18 years of Sunday dinners I hadn't been invited to. 18 years of Diane coming home from her father's house slightly different than when she'd left. Like a beam that had shifted a fraction of an inch under a load nobody else could see. 18 years of Gerald thinks, showing up in every conversation about my career, my income, my worth as a husband. And now that text, still sitting unanswered in my phone. Dad's lawyer. Something that can't wait. I think you need to call your own lawyer, Kevin said, before you call Diane back. I called Sandra Okafor the next morning. I'd used her once before, years ago, for a real estate closing. And what I remembered about her was precision, the way she asked exactly the right question and nothing more. She listened to everything I told her over the phone without interrupting, and then she said 4 words that put a cold weight in my stomach. Come in today, Raymond. I sat across from her desk 2 days after I'd been discharged, still moving carefully, still catching myself reaching for a chest that no longer hurt but hadn't forgotten how to. She had a legal pad in front of her, and she started asking questions, methodical, unhurried, the kind of questions that build toward something before you realize what they're building toward. When did Diane first mention her father's lawyer? Had any financial accounts changed recently, been renamed, restructured, moved? Had Diane asked me to sign anything in the last year that I hadn't looked at closely? Had I noticed any new subscriptions, new logins, anything quietly shifted into her name alone? I hadn't thought to notice any of it, because a man doesn't audit his own marriage the way he audits a bridge. But sitting there, answering her questions one at a time, I started to see the shape of something I hadn't let myself see before. Small things. A joint account Diane had asked me about consolidating 8 months ago, for simplicity, she'd said. A subscription to a cloud storage service I didn't remember signing up for, billed to a card I rarely used. An afternoon 4 months back when she'd asked, almost offhand, whether the house deed still had both our names on it, and I'd said of course, and neither of us had brought it up again. Sandra didn't tell me what any of it meant. She was too careful for that, too precise to hand me a conclusion before the facts had earned it. What she told me, gently but without softening the edges, was that when a spouse begins consulting family attorneys before notifying the other spouse, and financial records begin quietly shifting toward one name, that pattern has a shape she'd seen before. Not always, but often enough that it was worth taking seriously. I drove home from her office and sat in my own driveway for 20 minutes without going inside. I remember the engine ticking as it cooled, the house sitting there in front of me, the same colonial Diane had turned into something beautiful, and I thought about every closed door in a marriage that looks, from the outside, like it's still standing. Then I went in and I called her. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice had that same careful quality it had carried for months now. Measured, polite, the tone of someone who has already decided something and just hasn't said the words yet. I told her I was home. I told her Dr. Adler wanted me limiting stress, following up with a specialist. I told her Kevin had come and gone back to Cleveland. She said she was glad I was home safe. When are you coming back? I asked her. A pause, longer than it should have been. Then she said that she and her father had been talking, and they thought it might make sense for us to give each other some space while I recovered. So I could rest, she said, without any additional pressure. Diane, I said, whose idea was this? Another pause, longer than the first. It was a family conversation, she said. Her father thought it was the healthiest approach given everything going on. What is going on? I said. Not what your father thinks is going on. Not what Lena thinks. What do you think is going on? She didn't answer right away, and in that silence I heard something I'd been avoiding for a long time. I heard a woman who had let other people think for her for so long that she genuinely didn't know anymore what her own thoughts sounded like. It should have made me angrier than it did. Instead, it landed somewhere heavier, because a wife who chooses her father over you is one kind of wound, but a wife who's lost the ability to choose anything at all is another kind entirely, and I wasn't sure which one I was actually looking at. I need you to answer me honestly, I said. Not your father's answer, not Lena's, yours. Do you still love me? The silence that followed wasn't long, but it had the wrong shape to it, the shape of someone searching a room for something they used to know exactly where to find. I think I need some time, she said, to figure out what I feel. I thanked her for the honesty, told her to take whatever time she needed, and said that when she figured out what she felt, I'd like to know. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table in the house she'd made beautiful, and I let myself feel the full weight of it for the first time since the collapse. Not compressed, not filed away under things I'd deal with later. Just the whole honest weight of it, sitting on my chest the way pressure sits on a structure that's finally been allowed to show what it's actually carrying. The weeks that followed weren't a transformation. I want to be honest about that, because stories that skip from rock bottom straight to triumph do a disservice to what rebuilding actually costs. What came next was slow, quiet in a way that was almost unbearable some mornings. I followed up with the cardiologist. I started walking 3 miles along the river every day, past the boat rentals and the dog walkers and college kids jogging by with their whole futures still ahead of them, and I let that walk become the 1 hour of my day I didn't spend managing anything. I called Kevin twice a week, and those calls did more for me than I can measure. Diane came by the house 3 weeks after I was discharged. We sat at that same kitchen table, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, we had an honest conversation. She cried. I didn't, not because I wasn't feeling it, but because I'd spent 3 weeks finally learning how to sit with feeling instead of performing it. She told me she'd been lost, that she'd let her father and her sister fill in the gaps of our marriage with their own story, and let that story become the one she lived inside of. She said she knew the picnic photo had been wrong. She said she knew the text about the lawyer had been wrong. She said Gerald had been steering her for longer than she'd admitted to herself, and that she'd gone along with it because she'd always been more afraid of disappointing him than of losing me. I told her I believed her. I also told her I couldn't simply return to what we'd been before, not because I didn't still love her, but because a foundation doesn't get to skip the inspection just because everyone's tired of looking at the cracks. I collapsed at work, I said. I was alone in that hospital for 4 days. The 10 minutes you spent deciding whether to come, that's not something I can build past without both of us doing the actual work. Not your father's version, not Lena's, ours. She nodded. She didn't argue. We started counseling again, this time with a therapist named Dr. Theodore Marsh, and I kept my individual sessions too, every week now instead of twice and done. It was, genuinely, harder than any project I'd led in 22 years. But it was the first structural repair I'd ever made that mattered more than any bridge. Gerald called 3 months after my discharge. He talked about business for a while, the way he always used practical things as a runway before he got to what he actually wanted to say. Then he told me Diane seemed to be doing better, seemed more settled. He said he hoped I wasn't holding things against the family. I thought about 18 years of Sunday dinners, about a photo at a picnic table and 4 words underneath it. About a man who had spent nearly 2 decades measuring my worth by a scale only he could see, and finding me short every time. I'm not holding anything against anyone, Gerald, I said, but I'm not going to pretend what happened was nothing either. Diane was my emergency contact. I was in the hospital. We can both agree it wasn't handled the way it should have been. There was a pause. Then he said, I know. Just that, 2 words, quieter than anything I'd ever heard come out of him. Not an apology, but not nothing. Kevin came down for Thanksgiving. We sat at that same kitchen table and ate a meal I'd cooked myself, something I'd started doing in the quiet months when I needed my hands busy with anything that wasn't work. He asked what I'd do differently if I could go back. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I'd have said something sooner. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest, sitting at that table long before it became a crisis. I'd have stayed in Dr. Howell's office past 2 sessions. I'd have stopped letting a man who never once picked up a hammer decide what my worth was built from. And I would have told Diane, plainly, that love isn't something you inherit from your wedding vows and maintain by simply not leaving. It's a beam you have to keep reinforcing every day, especially on the days it would be easier not to. My marriage isn't repaired. I want to be honest about that too. Some weeks the work feels like it's building something real. Other weeks it feels like trying to rebuild a structure after a flood, when you're still not entirely sure the ground underneath has settled. Dr. Marsh tells us that's normal. That the fact we keep showing up to his office is its own kind of commitment, even on the weeks it doesn't feel like enough. My health is better. My numbers are good. I still walk the river every morning, rain or shine, because I've learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to say something is wrong before it becomes the kind of wrong that puts you on a concrete floor. I'm Raymond Calloway. I'm 47 years old. I'm a civil engineer, and I know better than most people how a structure fails, one small compromise at a time, until the load finally finds the crack nobody reinforced. My marriage taught me that lesson the hard way, but I also learned something else in that hospital bed, something no engineering degree ever could have taught me, and it's the only thing I really want you to take from this. The people who love you, truly, in the deep and irreducible way love is supposed to work, they don't run the numbers on whether to come. They don't weigh it, they don't calculate it, they don't decide it can wait until things settle down. They just come, and the people who have to calculate it first, that calculation, all by itself, tells you everything you need to know.